You're listening to a podcast from leagueculture.com.
Then in the 1960s, we sort of see Australia really do their effort to spread the game, where we get the game emerging in Papua New Guinea.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is that in a sense, it's a lot of this is to do with the British Empire, either the growth of the British Empire when rugby union expands, or the decline of the British Empire in the 1950s and 1960s, and you see opportunities emerging for rugby league. So in the 1960s, rugby league had first been played in Papua New Guinea during the Second World War by Australian servicemen. And then when the Australians realised that Papua New Guinea was a country rich in minerals that could be exploited, a lot of expat Australian workers went out there to work in the mines and work in the industries that had been set up there. And they naturally, because they were from New South Wales or Queensland, they played rugby league. And although initially, up until the 1960s, it was basically a game of Australian expats. But then it started to spread into the rest of the population. So Papua New Guineans started to play it. And it appears to have taken off like wildfire. As soon as the game was played, people saw the game. Papua New Guineans realised it was the game for them. And, you talk to people like Stanley G, Michaelia Zoo, and you can tell this is, just like if you're born and bred with rugby league in the north of England, they have exactly the same feelings as what people in the north of England or in Eastern Australia have. It's their game and they recognise it as their game. So it took off very, very rapidly. Bala played a big role, taking touring teams out there in the 70s and 80s. And then, for once, I think Rugby League internationally did quite a good job in fostering the game in Papua New Guinea. And so they came into the 1988, they were part of the 1988 World Cup, so at long last, after 30 years, the World Cup had expanded to, a fifth country outside of Australia, Britain, New Zealand and France. The PNG defeated France, they defeated New Zealand, they ran England, Great Britain fairly close on a number of occasions. And so, as I'm sure people are probably aware, if you listen to this podcast, it's a hugely important part of Papua New Guineans' everyday life. State of origin is possibly, if such a thing is even conceivable, as popular, if not more popular in Papua New Guinea than what it is in Queensland. And, there are a lot of really interesting, potentially very exciting things happening, like there's a PNG side now playing in the Queensland Cup, and hopefully that can be developed into something much bigger, and they're now going to be one of the host nations of the 2017 World Cup. So, in a sense, although the popularity of the game there hasn't been matched by the success of the national team, it is one of the great success stories of rugby league over the last 50 years. That it's it's a cliche now, we all say it's the one country in the world where rugby league is truly and unconditionally the national sport. But, to be fair, I think that's down to a lot of good work done by not only the people in Papua New Guinea, but also people in Australia and even here in Great Britain, and people, especially people like Bala, who played a pioneering role in taking international rugby league out there.
And I guess the next sort of stage, if you like, was the 80s, really. We saw a bit of movement in the USA and Canada.
Yeah, the other thing that we saw, before we get on to North America, the other thing that happened in the 1980s is that the game starts to get into the Pacific Islands as well. And that's really down to changes in society. Australia changed its immigration rules and it went from a white Australia policy where, nobody who didn't have a white skin was allowed in. The immigration changed in the 70s. And so you got people from Samoa, from Tonga, from Fiji, particularly settling in Sydney. And that started to change the nature of the game, both in New South Wales and Queensland. And you get, great players of Fijian heritage like Pt2, Jared Hayne, Samoans, Tongans, who were second generation, born and bred with rugby league in Sydney and Brisbane. And that changed the game both in Australia, but also allowed us, and I think this is one of the most fantastic things over the last 20 years, allowed Tonga, Fiji and Samoa to become serious international rugby league nations. And it's worth noting, and hopefully the International Federation will note this, those Pacific nations in rugby union have been very, very badly treated since rugby union went professional. They've been starved of money and they've not had any success. In rugby league, it's completely opposite story. As we all know from looking at Samoa and the Four Nations, they've got a great team. Fiji got twice to the World Cup semi-finals. And that's on the back of not just the players who are who have been born and bred with the game in Sydney and Brisbane, but also with those players players who have been born and bred in Samoa, Tonga and Fiji as well. So that's one of the great success stories of rugby league since the 1980s, I think. The North America is a really interesting example of the great what-if question. I think as rugby league supporters, we're all aware of, our history is a series of what-ifs. What if we'd have had a majority in the rugby union in 1895 and we'd have controlled rugby union? What if the game had spread to Wales? And one of the great what-ifs is North America's America and Canada. As I mentioned earlier, Canadian and American football evolved on the same principles, if not the same rules, as rugby league, that they wanted to find a way to get away from the scrummaging that dominated rugby union and go back to a try scoring or touchdown scoring, passing and running game. And so there's always a sense that amongst Americans and Canadians who knew about these things, that rugby league was the nearest type of game to their game. And even Walter Camp, who was known as the father of American football, was very, when he wrote about rugby in just before the First World War, was very complimentary about rugby. He said, well, this is a real game, and they're very similar to the way they play is very similar to our athletes. In 1928, the Lions on their way back from Australia and New Zealand stopped and played in Vancouver, in Canada, and there were a number of attempts. Harry Sunderland, the famous Australian and then later British rugby league journalist and administrator, attempted to get rugby league started in America in the 1930s, and even corresponding with George Halas, the founder and owner of the Chicago Bears, and tried to get a game between the Kangaroos and the Chicago, hybrid game between the Kangaroos and the Chicago Bears in the early 1930s. It didn't happen, sadly. Rugby union really almost died in America and became very small and insignificant in Canada. But it did, in America, rugby union started to develop in California in the 1930s. Obviously, it's on the Pacific coast. It looks towards, next stop. Well, if you look downwards, is Australia and New Zealand. And so there was always an awareness of rugby, and they'd played the All Blacks and the Wallabies before the First World War. Rugby union started to gain a little bit of traction in the 1930s, but they got very frustrated about the fact that they weren't getting any international games with either Australia or New Zealand, certainly not with any of the British nations. And in the summer of 1939, completely out of the blue, a letter arrived at the RFL headquarters in Leeds from the Californian Rugby Union, which said, we're very dissatisfied with rugby union and we're actively considering switching to rugby league. Could you send us a set of your rules? And so this created great interest in the rugby league. They sent rule books. They were also contacted by somebody from the north of England who was living in California. He said there's great opportunities. And at the annual conference, in those days, the Rugby League had an annual conference of the club's administrators every summer. At the annual conference, they passed a resolution. They're going to send 2 people out there. They're going to see what prospects for the game are in California. And if all works out well, Californian will become, part of international rugby league. And this is the biggest what if probably in the history of the game. It's summer 1939. On the 3rd of September 1939, World War II breaks out. And all bets are off. So that chance of rugby league being established in California was lost forever. However, what was just as unexpected was in 1943, in the middle of the war, a letter arrives at the rugby league headquarters from the Nova Scotian Rugby Union in Canada saying that we're very dissatisfied with rugby union and we've decided to start playing rugby league. Can you send us some rule books? Again, obviously it's very difficult. Because it's, if not impossible, because it's World War II. But because there are more links with British expats in Canada, remember at this time Canada was still a colony of or at least still part of the British Empire, the game starts in Nova Scotia and what are called the Maritimes, the eastern Atlantic facing states of Canada. And the game basically transplants rugby union. The rugby union club switch to rugby league and they start playing and they continue playing throughout the 1950s. However, they the problem in Canada is that, in a sense, that rugby league, because it's called rugby, which is seen as English rugby, the big game, the coming game, was Canadian football, particularly as TV started to take off and people had TV sets. And Canadian football's not all the time. It's also, Canadian football, even today, is very nationalistic. It's about, this is Canada's own game, this is a Canadian way of life. And so rugby league struggled. It also didn't get very much help from the British. Bill Fallowfield, who was the RFL secretary at the time, well, up until the 1970s, went over to Canada to try and help them, but he really didn't have much of an idea what to do. He gives them a lot of moral support, but he's not very good on guidance, how to deal with the media, how to develop expansion plans or anything like that. And the game essentially withers and dies, sadly. And it's not until the 1980s that things start to get going again. And it's really part of, a lot of it in Canada is down to expats. And it's also down to the initial beginnings of satellite TV. You can now see English Rugby League, Australian Rugby League on TV. And of course, once you see it, it's incredibly attractive. And if you want to play high impact collision, passing, running sport, then there's a good chance you're going to want to play this sport. And that's really what starts the ball rolling in Canada and America in the 1980s. In America, there've been a number of attempts to start the game in the 1950s. The Australians had played a game in California. And then, of course, as is described in Gavin Willis's fantastic book, No Helmets Required, there's an American All-Stars touring team that goes to Australia and in 1953 and also France in 1954. But nothing really comes of it. Sadly, despite, it's a fantastic story, and I'd really encourage everybody to read Gavin's book. Attempts are made in the 1960s, in the 1970s and 1980s. Mike Mayer, who was former professional American footballer, attempts to get rugby league off the ground. Wigan play Warrington in Milwaukee, but it never quite sticks, and I think it's because at that point there isn't, international links are still not as easy and straightforward as they would become in the 80s and 90s, when you get, obviously, satellite TV, the internet, cheap flights. Things become very much easier to organise. And so you have things like American teams entering the Sydney Sevens in the early 1990s. The Canadians, after a number of false starts, really start to get their act together, really over the last 10 years. I think there's some fantastic things going on in Canada today. And it's, in a sense, if you take the long view of history, it's kind of all those attempts that people have made to get the game going in North America ever since the 1920s, when the Lions first stopped off in Canada. They're beginning to pay off in a small but significant way today. So I think what's going on in Canada and America, it's very exciting. And although obviously the game's never going to compete with American football or Canadian football, there's a real opportunity that it can become a significant sport in, for a large section of Canadian and American sports fans.
Yeah, then that leads us into the 90s, really, where we see some unusual developments in places like South Africa and Russia.
Again, it's partly because the world is changing. And in a sense, and I might be slightly exaggerating here, but one of the problems that we had historically in expanding internationally was the fact we would always come up against rugby union, either in the way that the Italians or the Yugoslavian rugby league people did, in that they would just simply use their weight to force governments or associations to stop rugby league being played, or simply the fact that people in positions of power would automatically assume, because of their education or because of what knowledge they had of sport, that the Rugby Football Union, the International Rugby Union Board, was was proper rugby. That started to break down as communications became a lot easier, that people could see the game for themselves on TV. It started to break down, and this is what happened to some extent in Russia. There'd been attempts to start the game in Eastern Europe in the 1950s. In 1954, the Romanian Rugby Union, which was very successful in rugby union terms in the 1950s, approached the Rugby League, said, "We're very interested in your form of rugby. Can you send us some rule books, and we'd like to discuss the possibility of playing the game. Nothing ever came of that, partly because the Rugby Union decided that they wanted to head off any the potential that Romanian rugby would move to rugby league, and they were quite explicit about this. Again, the International Rugby Board, in its internal discussions, were quite explicit about the fact they wanted to stop rugby league and that their rules about playing rugby league had to be firmly adhered to by all participating nations. And also partly because the rugby football league was very lacklustre. I mean, I've got to say, if you got a letter from the Romanian Rugby Union saying, we're thinking about playing your game, you'd be on the next plane out there. But instead, they didn't try and make contact and were not proactive at all. So an opportunity was lost then. So there was an opportunity there that was never taken up. And Russia only started to play rugby union seriously in the 1960s anyway. So it wasn't stuck hard and fast with, it wasn't integrated into sort of rugby union culture in the same way that other countries were. And in the 1980s, as the game became more popular rugby union became more popular in Russia, there was some friction with the International Rugby Board. The Russians felt they were being discriminated against. As you might be aware, that the International Rugby Union Board was very closely linked to apartheid South Africa from the 1960s onwards. And the Russian Rugby Union felt that because of the Rugby Union's international links with South Africa, they weren't getting a fair shake of the dice. And in the late 1980s, they started to make contact with the Rugby League. And in 1989, again, amazingly, almost completely out of the blue, it was announced that Rugby League was starting in Russia. And I can remember going to Headingley in, I think it must have been either late 89 or early 1990, to watch the Moscow Magicians play the Leeds A team, which is like, at the time, seemed incredibly surreal to see a Russian team playing rugby league at Headingley. But it did capture the imagination of Russian rugby players and other sports fans. And I think it demonstrated the way in which, potentially, if it had developed properly, it would have, there was the potential for it to be like France in the 1930s, where it simply, if you like, caught fire and spread right around the rugby playing parts of Russia. It didn't, for a variety of reasons. One, because there was probably no worse time to start the game other than 2 years before the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so obviously there were huge political problems. The Soviet Union started to implode and nations started to break away, do their own thing. Nevertheless, the Russian rugby league, played in World Cups and has managed to survive despite a lot of setbacks. The withdrawal of, billionaire sponsors, and a tremendous amount of money that's been spent by the International Rugby Union Board there. And obviously now that rugby union 7-a-side is being played in the Olympics, that's tremendously attractive to government sports ministries, which means that rugby union gets a lot more support than what we get. But nevertheless, it's still the game is still surviving, even in the midst of the cold and sometimes hot war between Russia and the Ukraine. The game's still being played in Russia and the Ukraine even today. So again, I think it demonstrates that when the game, even when it takes small routes, it captures people's imagination. There's something about the nature of the game as it's played and its culture, I think, that is very attractive to people wherever they are. In South Africa, that's a much longer history, and obviously South Africa is one of the cornerstones of World Rugby Union. Yet there's been a number of attempts to start the game there. Perhaps the earliest one was in 1912, when a South African businessman wrote to the Rugby League of the Northern Union, as it then was, and said, I'd like to bring over a rugby team of coloured, as they call them, mixed race players to play. Can you assist me in making the arrangements? And the Northern Union said, well, we don't know anything about this person. We're not sure what the economics of it are. So they turned the opportunity down, which was a huge mistake, because despite the fact that rugby union in South Africa is overwhelmingly a white game, and particularly a white Afrikaner game, there's been a very strong history of black and mixed race rugby, particularly in the Western Cape, going back to the 1880s. And it could have been the case that if there had been a touring team, a non-white touring team that came over to play Northern Union, then there would have been a situation in South Africa, they would have gone back and non-white rugby in South Africa would have been playing rugby league, and the whites would have been playing rugby union, which would have completely changed both the international history of rugby league and the history of rugby in South Africa. But sadly, again, it's one of the great what ifs, and I think it's also the case that in general, rugby league has never missed the opportunity to miss an opportunity. But again, there were attempts to start rugby league in South Africa in the 1950s and early 1960s, and one of the reasons for that was because South African rugby union was amateur, and a lot of players didn't like the fact that they weren't getting paid. Springboks could attract, well, on occasions 100,000 people to international matches, and not a single penny of that found its way into the pockets of players. And so there's a lot of dissatisfaction.
But then there was a trickle of players that came over from South Africa from the 1920s, like George van Rooyen, who played for Hokies and Rovers, and Widnes, or Atti van Heerden came over to play for Wigan. And they came because they were working class white South Africans who were big stars in their own country but didn't make any money because of amateurism. And you can say exactly the same thing in a much bigger way in the late 1950s, the most famous being Tom van Vollenhoven, who was probably the greatest South African rugby union winner of all time. Fantastic record against the British Lions rugby union tourists. But he made no money from the game at all. And so when St Helens approached him, it was exactly what he wanted. He wanted to make money from his rugby playing skills. And at that point, in the late 50s, early 60s in South Africa, a lot of players came over to play rugby. Trevor Lake played for Wigan, Fred Griffiths, Alan Skeen, Colin Greenwood at Wakefield Trinity. And some of these were really big names in South African rugby union. Tommy Gentles, scrum half who didn't really make it, came over as well. But he was a huge name in South Africa. So there was an opportunity then to win, to do something, but partly because of the opposition of the South African Rugby Union, and also because I think although there were a couple of tours to South Africa or visits to South Africa on the way back from Australian trips in 1957 and again in the early 60s, there was something that didn't gel right with the culture of the game to be playing in apartheid South Africa, and you find that in the late 1950s, there were quite a lot of people in rugby league who were opposed to any links with South Africa, even as early as that. And certainly the editor of the Rugby League Gazette was very strongly opposed to doing anything with apartheid South Africa, for obviously very good reasons. So the game never caught on, partly through the usual story of missed opportunity, but also because it didn't really fit very well. And I think that's one of the problems that the game's always had in South Africa since it's been re-established. That to a greater or lesser extent, rugby league is kind of a non-establishment sport, and it doesn't sit very well with the culture of the game. It wouldn't have sat very well with the culture of the game to be involved in a sport that's very different in its ethos. And it's certainly a country that's very different in its ethos to what rugby league's about. So it was. So South Africa. I mean, there's a lot going on at the moment, and the game, has got good prospects of growing. Lots of clubs visit there as well, and there's been tours. But it's another story of missed opportunity. I think the interesting thing about the international history of rugby league is how, when the game has spread, it takes its own culture with it. That you go to anywhere where rugby league is played, whether it's Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, even places like Serbia and Lebanon, and you find people who've got the same, not only the same passion for the sport, but the same type of outlook on the world. I think there's a kind of back to the wall mentality, an understanding that, some things you've got to fight really hard for. And rugby league is an example of a sport that's had to fight for its existence. And I think it's interesting that despite the fact that people are obviously attracted to the game because it's an incredibly exciting product, it's great to watch, it's great to participate in. It also, it has its own very special culture. And I think that's one of the great things about the game. one of the things I've tried to do in the Oval World, because it is a game about it is a book about the games of Union and League, is try and sum that up, sum the differences between the two games and the culture of the two games up. And it's not just reflecting the way the games are played, but it's about what their philosophy about rugby is, how rugby should be played, and also really a way of an approach to life as well. And I suppose the final point about the book is that rugby's got the most interesting history of all sports. Now, obviously, I would say that because that's what I write about. But when you look at what rugby has gone through and the way it's been involved in all the significant events of the last century and a half, it's much more interesting than football or cricket or tennis or any other sport, because it's all about conflict. It's about conflict between Union and League, and then even within Rugby League, we're a sport that thrives on conflict and dissension. We were born in a spirit of split and schism and argument and division, and that's how the game is. And in a sense, that's our weakness, because we often spend so much time looking inward and arguing amongst ourselves. But it's our great strength, because it's given people that drive and determination to succeed. And given the obstacles that Rugby League has faced over the years, and we've talked about them earlier, the ban by Rugby Union, Vichy government, and all the little informal slights and disparagements and obstacles that have been put in the games, where, again, wherever it's been played around the world, it's a fantastic record to think where we are now, to think that those 21 guys who met in the George Hotel in 1895, what their decision led to is a game that we've got now that's played in something like over 30 odd countries, where the NRL can command TV deals worth billions of dollars, where there are teams in every county of England, rugby league teams in every county of England for the first time ever. The game's not as far as everybody would like it to be, but it's come a huge, huge long way in the 121 years since it was formed. And in a sense, so the Oval World is a tribute to those men who started the game and had such foresight to make that decision, without whom we wouldn't be here today.